I was somewhat surprised to learn that California is the fourth leading economy in the world, in front of even the nation of Japan. Yet they continue to demonstrate their incompetence at every turn. Our next guest, Chris Moritz, has actually written a book about the failed state, a portrait of California in the Twilight of Empire. Now, Chris is a really smart guy. He worked for BlackRock, or Blackstone, I should say. He is a mergers and acquisitions lawyer and attended UCLA undergrad and then NYU, where he got his law degree. Chris, we won't hold that against you. Welcome to the truth.
You should hold it against me. I hold it against myself.
Well, I attended Mercer Law School in Macon, Georgia. But I learned at a pretty early age that law was not where I wanted to spend the majority of my
Yeah,
time in my career. So,
same.
you are a native Californian, do I have
Yes,
that
sir.
correct?
Third generation.
But then you spent a lot of time on the East Coast at the beginning of your career and while you were in college.
Actually, I've spent most of my career in California. I started working in financial services after graduate school, and then I went to law school on the East Coast. But then, after law school, I actually lived in China for 2 years, where I worked in Shanghai as an investment banker for a state-backed bank. So I'm
Well,
one of the very few Americans who's ever actually worked for a state-owned enterprise in China. I was one of two Westerners at a 10,000 person Chinese bank out of Shanghai and Hong Kong.
I had that on my list to talk to you about, but since you
Mm,
went ahead and opened the subject, let's stay here for a moment.
sure.
China, I have got an outline actually, and if you haven't heard it yet, but if you listen to my monologue from today's broadcast, it is called "We Are at War," and I've made the case that we are literally at war with China. They
Mm,
float spy balloons over our country and hover over our most sensitive nuclear bases. They have bought up hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland around our military bases. They have flooded our southern border with fentanyl. They have introduced, according to Maria Bartiromo, 150,000 military age fit men have crossed the southern border and now live in the heartland and dispersed throughout our country. And then just this week, we've
yeah.
learned that two students from the University of Michigan um, colluded to bring in a fungus that they
Yes.
evidently intended to unleash
Yeah.
on the American people. We know
Yeah.
that the coronavirus originated in the Wuhan laboratory. Was it an intentional release or was it a mistake? I tend to err toward the former, but I don't have evidence of that. I just observe all the repercussions from the release. They were either very smart and shrewd and cunning, or it just was an accident that had devastating consequences, especially for
Yeah.
8 of my close friends. So tell us what you know about China. What do you think?
Sure.
Are we at war with China? It certainly feels like it. Robert Spalding, by the way, a retired general, has written
Yeah.
a book called Stealth War. He says
Yes.
we're at war. What your opinion?
Yes. I think that we are in some form of pre-war, is what I would call it, some sort of asymmetric war, and it's sort of harkens back to Sun Tzu of winning the war before you ever fight the battle, and they very much adhere to these sort of ancient principles. But look, I, I have felt more or less align with you since COVID. And the reason is not so much that I think they intentionally released it, it's more that they intentionally allowed it to spread. And the idea was that when they realized they had a contagion on their hands within Wuhan and in greater China, they allowed planes to travel internationally while they uh, restricted them domestically. To me, that is prima facie demonstration of you know, malice and in fact kind of, I would even go so far as say a kind of murder, because they understood the danger of of the virus, and they restricted it internally in terms of travel, but they allowed international travel. And I think the reason is because they felt, as China does, that, well, if we are going to suffer, then everyone else have to suffer, so that we do not restrict our growth in any way. So that's how I looked at it from the get-go. You know, it is, we can't forget the fact that Mao and the CCP are the greatest killers in human history. I think it was, I've heard numbers of like 100 million people in the 20th century under Mao, under his various programs. So look, I look at it that way, but I will say that there's nuance to it. Okay, so let me share an anecdote I have never actually told before, and I think it's very, very interesting. In fact, it's one of the most poignant moments of my time over there. I was doing a deal with Israeli company, Israeli engineering company, and I was at a company dinner in the city of Hangzhou, which is kind of south of Shanghai, and we're sitting around this, we're sitting around the table and discussing Xi, who was really coming into his ascendancy during that time, which was 2017. And the Israeli counterparts, which are kind of a shadowy business, frankly, and had large real estate holdings in China, had so for many years, which is kind of unusual, raises some questions in and of itself. The chairman of the company said to us that he was very supportive of Xi because, through his consolidation of the party and rooting out corruption, he had made China a much better place to do business and reined in the Chinese people. And my boss, who is a young investment banker, but a member of the party, turned to him and said, "Look, the Chinese people do not need an emperor." And I was stunned by this, because it suggested to me that there is definitely not some sort of, it is not a monolith. And there are plenty of Chinese, even in the party, that do not want the kind of oppression that Xi has brought. And let's not forget the fact that prior to Xi, China was on the path to some form of liberalization. Because in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, China was run by Shanghai. The Shanghai communists are not the same breed as the Beijing communists, and they are commercially focused. So under Hu Jintao, we were seeing a direction that was positive and towards a kind of normalization that gave the world hope. But Xi is a Stalinist. And Xi is determined to achieve hegemony in Asia, and that is diametrically antithetical to the United States' position in the world. So we are heading in a very dark place.
The CCP has said that they want to dominate the world by 2049, and it appears that they are have infiltrated our country in a very significant and material way. They have police stations, for God's sakes, in New York, Houston, your city of Los Angeles. I mean, why are we permitting this to happen? And I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't know whether it was clickbait, whether I was being trolled, but I read an article yesterday that said the governor of Arizona had vetoed a law prohibiting the Chinese to own property in Arizona. Is that possibly true? I cannot imagine that someone would veto that kind of a law.
I haven't heard of that in Arizona. It doesn't surprise me knowing what the governor is, but look, California is deeply infiltrated. In fact, CalPERS, the California Pension Fund, state pension fund, used to be run by a member of the CCP. Like he was actually, if not an actual member, he was de facto member. He used to run one of the big pension funds in China and was directing in California investments into China. And when I was in the Commerce Department in 2020, the last year of the Trump administration, and in 2019, 2020, we were tasked by the president to develop a deep analysis and database of all U.S. outbound investment into China going back 20 years. And so I looked at Bloomberg source data, and we found that the total sum of holdings of U.S. institutional money into Chinese equity, meaning Chinese stock exchanges and Hong Kong, was over $1.5 trillion. BlackRock had $300 billion position. And of course, also down the line, you have Vanguard, State Street, JP Morgan. And it's not just, positions in Alibaba or, benign Chinese consumer companies. We were talking about positions into surveillance companies, into advanced AI companies, into robotics companies, into entities that clearly had a direct correlation, and if not, were themselves military related. So we are sort of selling ourselves out, and we have been for a long time. I would say since allowing China to enter the WTO was the most disastrous betrayal of all time.
Who did that? Was that George W.?
It was Clinton.
And
George W. Bush helped it along, but it was primarily Clinton and Larry Summers, one of the most disgusting, people in the world.
Peter Schweitzer, who's been on our program a couple of times, has written two very compelling books, one called Red Handed and the other called Blood Money. And in both cases, in both books, he makes the case for how China has not only enmeshed itself with the United States and our economy, but it has literally co-opted many of our leaders, including Nancy Pelosi, whose husband does business with companies with ties to the CCP, with the late Dianne Feinstein's husband, who has 90% of his business evidently is with the CCP-controlled companies. Gordon Chang has written a really compelling book called Plan Red. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Robert Spalding's Stealth War. Yeah. I mean, I think, and Christopher Wray, for whom I have very low regard and very little respect, but the one thing that he did say that really I think every American should stand up and listen to is that China is our number one threat to our country. Yeah. And I'm so glad to hear that you're reporting that President Trump is not in denial, that he required you to conduct that study. Wilbur Ross and Bob Lighthizer, your former colleagues, have been on our show, and both of them are friends of mine. They live just miles from here, and I see them socially. They're wonderful human beings and great patriots. I wish that Lighthizer was back in the administration. He was rumored to be on the short list for Treasury, and he didn't get it. He's a very independent thinker and doesn't really, kiss the ring probably. But anyway. Yeah. Well, so I hope that we can decouple from China. I mean, where it makes sense to do business with them, we should. I mean, but you look at the American companies, you read out a long list, but what about consumer companies like Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola? And what about Tesla? They have huge markets in China. And it's easier said than done to just say, hey, sacrifice your corporate profits. We're not going to let you do business there anymore. I don't think that letting people drink Coca-Cola would be a bad thing. And I don't think giving them flights on Delta is a bad thing either. In fact, it might be good because we can turn on and off the linkage back to the United States when and if necessary. But decoupling, especially in pharmaceuticals, is something that we need to do quickly.
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, the fentanyl crisis originates in China. It would not be possible if it were not for the active pharmaceutical ingredients for fentanyl being sold to Mexican drug cartels through trade laundering in a very complicated exchange that ultimately has resulted in the mass poisoning of the American people. And it's not a coincidence that China has a grudge that is an enmity from the so-called opium wars of the late 19th century, and they're very much cognizant of that. And the fact is, look, also the problem with doing business in China is that every kind of joint venture requires um, a local partner, right? So you can't do business in China without getting a joint venture and a local partner. Those local partners are themselves tied to the government because all companies in China are. And there is, there is civil military fusion as a doctrine in China. So you can never really be sure that you are just doing independent business in China. And in fact, paranoia pervades the entire ecosystem. I mean, I
Hmm.
just living there, you do feel like you are being watched, and you are. So it is a strange experience. I'm very glad I did it because, firstly, at that time, the relationship was better between the United States and China, but also I think it's very important to understand vividly and viscerally, what our adversary is, and that's why I was so intrigued to take that journey.
Well, they certainly have very little value for human life. Maybe they do for their
Correct.
own, but we know they've committed genocide against their own people.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't think we know the final story on the coronavirus, but what was the number? 2 million people in the United States, I believe, died from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know how many, 8 million worldwide? I can't remember
Yeah.
exactly.
I thought it was like 8 to 11 or
Yeah,
something.
a horrendous number. And so, if that was in any way intentional, all I know, the thing that makes me, I guess, the most suspicious is that there was a doctor from the Wuhan lab that was speaking publicly about it. And within 24 hours, she disappeared and has not been
Yeah.
seen or heard of
Yeah.
since. So
Well,
that makes me highly suspicious. What are they hiding? And
look,
you know,
they are also have a one of the other things we were doing when I was in the government was we tried to I wrote an executive order. It never got signed, unfortunately, because uh, frankly, Matt Pottinger had resigned. He was our sponsor for the order, and that was because of January 6th. But it was to apply uh, restrictions through the Commerce Department to an entity called BGI Genomics, which is a Chinese biotech company. It's one of their national champions. And BGI Genomics was disseminating COVID testing kits all over the world, but especially to U.S. states. And we believed, and multiple agencies believed, that they were actually just trying to collect the genetic data of Americans. And the reason they're doing that is because they're developing and testing pathogens that will affect or not affect certain populations. All right, so it's a kind of ethnic cleansing in
that's scary
preparation.
stuff. That is
Yeah.
seriously scary stuff. All right, well, we better talk about California before we run out of time. You've got a new book. It's called The Failed State, uh, and I believe it was released just in March of this year. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yep.
And how's it doing? Are you getting rich? I hope.
Uh, that was not really the point. The point was to tell the story of what's happened to California, my home, and the degradation that we've all seen, even nationally, and trying to explain not only the scope of that, but the origin of that. And the book is about crime, at least that angle of California's descent. And it stems from an incident that happened to me in 2023 when my family home in Santa Monica was home invaded style burglarized two nights in a row on one weekend in September, and the burglar was a illegal alien, MS-13 gangster, convicted felon who had been deported by President Trump in 2018 and who came back into the country under the Biden invasion. And he went on a string of these kinds of what's called a hot prowl burglary, which means that the person is home at the time of the incident, but doesn't necessarily encounter them. And it's just a miracle that I didn't. And my brother was also in the house when this happened.
Well, why would he want to enter someone's home when they're there if he could do so when they're not there?
Right. I think it was more that he was that brazen and prepared for violence.
Well, I'm so glad you're all right, and I'm so sorry you had that experience. I have not suffered from a burglary or home invasion in my lifetime. I cannot think of anything that would be more terrifying than to realize that someone has entered your home while you're there. But
it was a surreal experience, yeah.
Well, what is the matter with California?
Well,
I mean, I just read this morning that the Trump administration was canceling its investment in the bullet train. Billions of dollars have been spent, and I think only a mile of track has been laid after 10 years. And Trump said, okay, no more. If that's the best you can do with billions of dollars in 10 years.
Tens of billions of dollars.
Tens of billions. So do you think it may have gotten into somebody's pocketbook?
Of course it did. I mean, this state is so rotten, and it starts at the top. We have a situation where you have had a one-party system, and not unlike China in some ways, where both houses of the legislature and all statewide elected offices have been continuously held by the Democratic Party since 2012. Gavin Newsom is a product. He has been developed like a product in an R&D lab by the Getty family and other power interests in the state. And they have facilitated his entire, not only his wealth, but his entrance into San Francisco politics and then beyond. And of course, they have aspirations beyond California. I think we can all expect to see Gavin run for the presidency, despite the ubiquitous decline that characterizes the state that he supposedly governs.
So I have a paradigm that the Democrats love to elect incompetence. And you just look at the fact that they basically installed Biden, then they clearly installed Harris as the nominee. And so as you were starting to talk about Newsom, my first thought was, well, good luck with that one because he's completely botched running California. But that may be exactly why the Democrats want him, because then they can control him. They can own him.
Yes, correct. 100%. In fact, what I found is that, so again, my book is about crime, and I wanted to kind of find the origins of how we got to be the most violent state in the nation, where you are more likely to get robbed, burglarized, beaten up, and carjacked than any other state, and in many cases by double. And how this happened in the state that's supposedly the fourth largest economy in the world. Well, it happens because a vested kind of billionaire class has funded through institutions like Stanford and direct kind of influence over the legislature, policies that have decriminalized entire sections of the penal code. And this was especially at its crescendo following in the 2020 to 2022 period, but it starts long before that. I mean, you can trace this back to, I'd say, 2010. And at every step, you have this money interest funding policies that will um, uh, foreseeably result in a diffusion and intensifying of crime. And so you ask yourself why, and it's kind of the $1 billion question. Why do uh, why do institutions like Stanford want to um, uh, you know promulgate laws that result in decriminalization? Why do certain institutions and endowments and um, fund people like George Gascon and Pamela Price in Oakland? Oakland, by the way, has a murder rate of 33 per 100,000. The national average is 4 per 100,000. Oakland is one of the most dangerous cities in the Western Hemisphere. Um, and it's just complete anarchy. So how did we get to this point? And I think that on the one hand, you have a legislature that is filled with lunatics. I mean, literally lunatics. You have governors and statewide elected officials like Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom that are not actually ideological. They are just products, and they fail upwards. And power is sort of the end goal. Um, and then down the downstream, we have local officials like George Gascon, the former DA of Los Angeles, and others who are anarchists. They want to burn the system down. In fact, in the course of my interviews for my book, every single prosecutor that I spoke to, up and down the coast, would say that what is the ultimate goal of the criminal justice reform movement, and these prosecutors that seem to want to decriminalize crime, and are for sure more sympathetic to the criminals than to victims. And they'd say, well, look, they want to burn the system down. And that system being sort of traditional America. I mean, you might even say, frankly, white America. You might say, the patriarchy, but in any event, the status quo has to be dismantled for them to have the kind of racial justice, or what I call crime equity, enacted. So it's a complicated problem, crime in the state, but nevertheless, we have arrived at a point where I would say California has forfeited the number one responsibility of government, which is to uphold the social contract, i.e., protect citizens in exchange for their giving up their freedom to the government, protect them from the anarchy of the state of nature. And California has failed in that regard. And when a state has failed to protect its people and at least uphold justice, because I'll tell you, in my case, the guy who did all this and committed dozens of these crimes, he wasn't even prosecuted in Los Angeles County because there's no point. So he was only charged in Ventura County to the north for one count of these and got 2 years in jail and a $300 fine.
So was he prosecuted by George Gascon's office or Nathan Hochman?
That would be George Gascon.
Gascon. And then now it does seem like the pendulum, and he was completely laissez-faire, hands off, very tolerant of crime.
I would say he was. That would imply indifference.
Indifference, yes.
But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it was not indifference. It actually was actively benefiting criminals in the name of what he regarded as racial justice.
Okay, and then he was replaced by Nathan Hochman. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Nathan Hochman.
Okay, and the electorate put a law and order guy in, did they not? So is the pendulum swinging?
Prop 36.
Is the pendulum swinging back?
I think that it's gotten so bad, John, that even progressive California has realized, like, we don't want to get robbed, raped, and murdered.
Yeah,
like,
hello.
you know? And you know what's really, I'll tell you something that's really interesting. And I think it's one of the most fascinating reads on the election, this last election that I've come across. And of all places from Mother Jones, right? A very far, like left wing, traditionally far left, progressive publication. But they did a study of, and this is, I mentioned this in my book, they did a study of electoral results in Southern California. And they looked at where the swing between to Trump or to Kamala was greatest, and where it was, which way the kind of what was the delta, how did it move, and they found that by going to East Los Angeles, several districts in East Los Angeles that are 99% Latino, and in many cases are illegal alien population, that those districts swung the most towards Trump. Whereas in places like I live, in Santa Monica and on the coast, like these white enclaves, they actually went more towards the Democrats in the last cycle. So, and in fact, Mother Jones went into these like barrios in East LA, and they were talking to locals, residents about, how they voted. And there was this amazing, poignant anecdote where they come across this one woman who says, she's for Trump, and then she says, "Soy illegal." So she's an illegal alien, and what they're against is the new illegals coming in. It's very it's very interesting, the dynamics that are taking place here, and I don't think they're all negative. I think there will at some point be a course correction. There has to be, but the question is, how much do people in California have to suffer before things turn around?
Now, before we run out of time, I want to make sure we allow enough time to talk about the fires. Now, you're in Santa Monica, and my son we talked earlier, is in Adams, West Adams, and he was about 10 miles from the leading edge of the fire. So I assume you were relatively safe as well.
I was 1 block away from the evacuation zone.
Oh, wow. That is really too close for comfort. But you escaped unscathed.
Yeah. I mean, the fire did not spread to Santa Monica, fortunately. And it was only by kind of an act of God that it didn't. The winds were unusually strong. The Santa Ana winds that week. However, the Santa Ana winds are not some phenomenon that we are not familiar with and should not be prepared for. You have cavalry officers from the 1860s writing about this,
they're somewhat predictable, are they not? I mean, aren't they seasonal to some extent?
There was certainly forewarning that there was going to be very intense winds, and yet Mayor Karen Bass left her post and went to Ghana for some diplomatic event. And I think that just underscores like the level of indifference and callous stupidity of the elected officials in California. I'll tell you, one of the things that you probably have not heard about the fires that I actually can comment on directly. I mean, obviously I saw them. I mean, you just walk 2 blocks down the street from me and you could see the hills of the Palisades were on fire. Wow. I mean, like not just on fire, like it was. It's very hard to describe. I mean, the conflagration. Sun turned red. It turned red. The air was acrid, and you couldn't breathe for days. It was like an apocalypse. But in my neighborhood in Santa Monica, we had 150 looters from East LA and South LA come into our neighborhood as basically of course invaders, but bandits and raiders, and they were just targeting houses that that had been evacuated. And my brother even encountered a group of gangsters, and they were very serious, scary criminals. And Santa Monica police arrested 48 of these gangsters. 150 were chased out. The level of viciousness was truly beyond belief. I heard a story about a house that was in the evacuation zone, and the family had left, and they had their security cameras on their phone, and so they could watch what was happening at the house. And they watched as an entire burglary crew came into their house, and for 4 hours dismantled the house, took literally everything, stripped it bare. So vicious that they took family pictures out of the frames and ripped them up, and then
God,
took the frame.
what could
Yeah,
possess people to be that callous and that
hate, hate,
just hate?
evil hate.
Yeah, just evil hatred. I think you're right.
Yeah.
So, your opinion: the fires accidental or intentional?
Uh, I would say negligent. I would say gross negligence. The reservoir that fed uh, the Palisades was dry for over a year, the Santa Ynez Reservoir, because it had some issue with a maintenance and repair. And in LA and in California, capital expenditure is just like the last thing people think of. And the head of the Department of Water and Power, a DEI hire named, I think, Janice Quinones, who's a friend of Karen Bass and makes $750,000 a year, and had direct authority over repairing things like the Santa
Yes.
Ynez Reservoir. Well, she taught you. I've seen interviews of her, and her priority is like DEI. I mean, she just says it. And what does that have to do with Department of Water and Power? Well, you know what? It's actually just to cover up the fact that she's grossly incompetent. And her last job prior to this was with the utility company PG&E, which burned alive like 25 people in Paradise, California in 2018 during those horrible fires. Look, it takes 7 years to get approval to do brush fires in the state of California, right? We don't do them. And yet we wonder why these fires keep happening in a desert. Like it's madness.
What a shame.
They worship the global warming cult. It's a cult. And they just and the California Coastal Commission will prevent other kinds of maintenance along the coastline that would also help alleviate the pressures and intensity of what is our natural environment, which is a desert, a dry desert that also happens to have this extreme wind phenomenon. But we've known about it, since the missionaries.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate it. And Failed State is available where? How do we find it? And how do we keep track of you?
Amazon's probably the best spot, and Barnes and Noble. And you can follow me on X at Chris G. Moritz.
Chris G. Moritz from Santa Monica, California. Thank you for a very informative interview today. We appreciate your time and come back soon and often.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.